President, fellows, ladies and gentlemen, if we could just set aside for a moment that throwaway remark that Richard made during the question period, I think I can say without fear of contradiction that Richard is absolutely brilliant at the art of self-deprecation. You think back to his opening remarks in particular. However, if you then take the lectures, these lectures prove resoundingly that the judgment is incorrect. So I would just like to begin by looking at what we have received, as it were, over this weekend, over these 3 days. First of all, Richard has done what it said on the label, as it were. He has given us an account of late medieval Scottish church architecture. But I actually feel he's done a great deal more than that. When I construct the form of the lectures and the period that they covered, in theory, there is a sort of introduction, as it were, or a pre-period to the late 14th and 15th centuries. But that's not how it looks to me as I stand at the end of the lecture series. I think that I have been given a picture of 4 centuries of Scottish church architecture. And that's one of the main things that I would simply like to say thank you to him for. There is also the fact that he has taken the general lines of his argument and then illustrated them and developed them with regard to particular buildings and particular aspects, like Melrose Cathedral as something on the international stage, small buildings like those at Carnwath and Corstorphine. And then, when he has done this, he always seemed to me to remember to link this back to the big picture so that you kept with him in terms not just of detail, but also of, as I say, form, as it were. Everybody will have their favorite building or aspect amongst those that Richard has discussed. For me, one of my favorites is, I don't think this will surprise anyone, those pointed barrel vaults. First of all, Richard told us how they were different in form from the standard 4 or 6 part rib vault. Then he pointed out that they are very difficult to parallel in other countries, especially the countries that he has been looking at for source material, England, France, and the Low Countries. And this is something which is a real mystery. I mean, the parallels are all 300 years old. Is it then a revival? Why is it a revival? And the other aspect of it is because of the form, and he made the point in the just a few minutes ago, it almost forces the designer to think in terms of a 1 or 2 stage elevation. And that seems to fit with exactly what was happening in Scotland in the design of church elevations over 1 or 2 centuries. That is the weakening of the importance of the middle story. I could go on. I could say something similar about what he said about tracery, for all those examples which provide you with links, suggestions, an archbishop being somewhere when something turns up which is present in a building in the place that he has been, all of these things. Also, the relevance of secular buildings to many aspects of church buildings. I could go on, but I won't. What I want to do instead is to look at something not that Richard has been saying, but that he has left out. Now, just before you think I'm about to launch into one of those nasty leg-biting academic arguments, I entirely, well, let me say what he's left out first. Liturgy. Now, there have been remarks, particularly today, there were aspects, but if you think back to Friday and Saturday, there was one exception, and that was the Collegiate Church at Seaton, where he talked about the rib vaulting, identifying the sanctuary, and also the positioning of the magnate's tomb being right for it being used as an Easter sepulchre. But apart from that, he wasn't talking about the liturgy. Now, in this, I am entirely on his side. There is a real issue here. Over the last few years, more than one architectural historian has criticized architectural historians writing about church architecture who don't discuss the liturgy. and who use words like the buildings remain empty, the buildings remain echoing, and things like that. Now, of course, I agree immediately that you can get a lot out of studying the liturgy with the buildings. What I am talking about is the requirement that you study the liturgy with the buildings. And I say this for two reasons in particular. First of all, I have never read a review of a book on the liturgy which has upbraided the book or the author of the book for not discussing architectural history. And the second thing is, I do not believe that medieval churches were machines for worshipping in. In fact, I suspect that in most cases it was the liturgy that had simply to fit itself into how the building had been designed. And this is, I think, one of those things that I really appreciate in what Richard has done. In other words, all those variations which you see in the buildings which he's been illustrating, I imagine the patron, whether this is lay or ecclesiastical, discussing these things with, or it's the patron's agent, that must obviously often be the case, discussing with the master mason, why have you got this different tracery? This tracery is from Paris. This is the very latest, But won't it be more expensive? Oh, yes, it will be more. But just imagine when the magnate from round the corner comes to a service in your church and you can, all this sort of thing. I think this is a real issue where we are talking not about meeting the requirements of tombs and the liturgy and so on, but meeting the requirements of what people think of as great building. And this is what Richard has, for me, done anyway. There's one last thing that I would like to mention, and that is the manner in which he has presented this material. I don't know how many, I suspect I speak for a lot of people, if not everybody. I don't feel as if I've listened to a series of lectures. It is almost as if Richard is having a conversation with his audience, which makes everything so much more digestible. And I even have an objective measure of this, at least objective inside myself. And that is that on Friday, in the lectures on Friday and Saturday, I managed to recalibrate my internal expectations by Sunday. But at the end of each lecture, when Richard signaled that he was coming to the end of the lecture, I found myself completely involuntarily saying, we've been shortchanged. That can't possibly be an hour. and so brilliantly handled and expressed. So for all those reasons, I would ask you, ladies and gentlemen, to join me in thanking Richard for this splendid masterclass in the subject and in its presentation. Richard.